Okay, let's go ahead and get it started. Good morning. This is Steve Duble. I'm the Vice President of Harris County Democratic Lawyers. Our President, Mike Dawes, on a road trip to go visit his parents out in Georgia. So he asked me to fill in today. We have a really good panel today on a very important topic, the eviction crisis. And we've got several judges, we've got Representative Walle and several advocates joining us on the panel. Before we get to that, a few quick announcements. Texas Democratic Lawyers Association is joining us today, lawyers from all across the state. And together with them, Harris County Democratic Lawyers and Meyerland Democrats is hosting an appellate panel meeting with Amy Meacham, who's running for the Supreme Court, Kathy Ching, also running for the Supreme Court, Stacey Williams, and Gisela Trana. And I believe we also have some Texas Criminal Court of Appeals judges of that, Elizabeth Frizzell, Tina Clinton, and Brandon Bingham. That will be October 19th. It will not be a CLE event, but we hope you can join us for that and to meet those important candidates. That is October 19th from 7 to 8:30. It'll be a Zoom event. Also, I need to announce that given the COVID concerns and the recent events in Washington with that ceremony in the Rose Garden, we have decided it's just not prudent to try and do an event, even if it's outside. And we were planning to do the Clarence Darren event October 29th at the Zaza on the patio. We have indefinitely postponed that. It will happen at some point, but we've decided it's just not a good idea to have a gathering like that at this time. Today we have with us a featured candidate. He's running for JP. I'd like to introduce him, Israel Garcia. If you could just give us a couple minutes of an update on your campaign and introduce yourself to everybody out there.
Thank you, Stephen. My name is Israel Garcia. I'm a candidate for Justice of the Peace, Precinct 5, Position 1. Thank you all for having me on today. As many of you may or may not be aware, the jurisdictional limits of JP Court are now $20,000 as of September 1st. The JP, which sits on, according to the Legal Voters interview, is the largest JP in the state of Texas. He is not a lawyer. I have been a lawyer for 27 years in private practice. I have practiced law, criminal law, on the state local level. Handling many lawsuits on both sides of the bar. Current judge that sits on the bench has the highest disapproval rating for the HCDLA. He's done the second most evictions. So the current judge has done the most evictions since March, since the pandemic began, and he is number one in doing the most weddings. So we need to change that. We need a lawyer on the bench who cares about what's going on in the community and the nation at large. As you know, we do have a very serious problem. That's why we're here today. And that's what I'm hoping that we can change. A lot of the JPs are doing the different programs. And so there's not a uniform strategy for anybody right now. So this is all new. We need to keep people safe. We need to keep people off of the streets. We need to keep people in their homes. I'm ready to win this election. We've been campaigning for about 2 years. I did garner the most votes out of both the Republican side and the Democratic side back on Super Tuesday. I was not in a runoff. And if you'd like to help, my website is www.israelgarcia4jp.com. I would appreciate any help you could provide, and I'm ready to go and serve the people of Harris County. Thank you so much.
Great, good luck to you. We'll put your info up on our chat room for everybody. And it's an important reminder, people, when you go to vote, and go early vote, starts what, the 13th, go all the way down the ballot. Include people like Israel Garcia, if he's on your ballot, and Christian Menifee, who's gonna be way down at the bottom of the ballot. It's very important that you go down all the way down the ballot and vote Democrat all the way. Thank you. And now I'm gonna introduce Judge Jim Kovach, County Court at Law Judge. And he is gonna briefly introduce the panel, and I'm going to turn it over to him, and we'll have some Q&A towards the end. And if you want to put your questions in the chat room, we'll try and get to them. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Duble. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay.
Clear.
Okay, thanks. So My name is Judge Jim F. Kovach, and I am the judge of Harris County Civil Court at Law Number 2. I'm also the administrative judge. There are 4 county civil courts at law, and we handle all of the appeals from the Justice of the Peace Courts. So there's 16 Justices of the Peace Courts, and if a case is appealed from them, they'll land in one of the 4 county courts at law. It's important to know that every single eviction case in Harris County, regardless of the dollar amount, you could have somebody in a garage apartment all the way up to somebody in a commercial lease and high-end office space. If it's for possession, the eviction begins in the Justice of the Peace Court. And so my court handles those appeals. I'd like to go ahead, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. November 1 will be 29 years. I've been a practicing lawyer. And on this bench, I'm the first Democrat to be in the county civil court at law for 24 years, except for Judge Barnstone, who got in a little bit ahead of us. So I'd like to go ahead, and we have some great folks today here to talk about eviction matters and how it's affecting the tenants in this pandemic. I'd like to have everybody, when I call your name, if you'll please introduce yourself and tell the participants who you are. And I'll start with Representative Armando Walle, who is also our Harris County Recovery Czar. And if you'll please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Judge. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the Harris County Democratic Lawyers Association for this opportunity to talk to you guys and give you a little briefing. Armando Walle, member of the Texas Legislature, been in office for now over a decade, my 6th term, and also running unopposed for my 7th term in the legislature. So just glad to be on with a lot of my colleagues, folks that I work with on a weekly basis. Thank you, Judge. And I know I'll probably give some remarks in a few minutes.
Yeah, we'll ask you about some legislative matters too. So the next is Justice of the Peace, Jeremy Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jeremy Brown, Justice of the Peace for Precinct 7, Place 1. Precinct 7 is the south side of Houston, 3rd Ward, Sunnyside, Hiram-Clark area. And as Judge Kovach said, that as a JP, we are the original jurisdiction for eviction cases. So thank you, and I look forward to this great conversation.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Eric Kwartler from South Texas College of Law. He's an attorney. And for all of you lawyers out there, you probably know this is not unusual to have a few minor difficulties in court proceedings these days. We'll get Mr. Kwartler to try to unmute his mic. How about Ms. Lewis, if you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I can introduce myself, sure. My name is Yue Lewis, and I am currently the chair of the Houston Lawyers Association's Judicial Oversight and Selection Committee. And that is one of the oldest minority and Black bar associations here in Houston and the surrounding areas. I have an extensive background in building practice on eviction defense, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. And how about you, Ms. Middleton? And then I see we're going to have Mr. Kwartler here by a second way also. But go ahead, Ms. Middleton.
Yes, hello, everyone. My name is Zoe Middleton. I'm the Southeast Texas co-director of Texas Housers. We're a fair housing policy advocacy organization, always thinking about tenant rights, but especially since the middle of March and how to manage the harm and reduce the harm of the eviction crisis. And it should be noted that I am not a lawyer.
Thank you.
Movement person.
Thank you. And remind all the panelists to please make sure to speak forward and into the microphone to make sure everybody can hear us. Mr. Kwartler, are you able to speak now?
There we go.
There we go. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
I'm so glad, because you're one of the main speakers. Once you introduce yourself, you can tell people why you're so important to this CLE, actually.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry about that. My name is Derek Kwartler. I am a public interest attorney at South Texas College of Law, Houston. I run the landlord tenant clinic there. I'm also a founding member of the Eviction Defense Coalition, which is a collaborative of legal service providers that is working toward providing a right to counsel, hopefully eventually in Harris County for eviction cases. Thank you,
Mr. Kwartler. So what I was going to do is we want to be cognizant of Representative Walle's time, and he has may have to leave for another appointment. But if you'll please tell us about what is the Harris County Recovery Czar, and and what is happening in terms of state, county, city for related to tenants and rental assistance?
Sure, Judge. Thank you. And I'll try to go as fast as I can because there's a lot to cover. But so thank you, Judge, for giving me this opportunity. So let's back up. So when the pandemic hit early, March, that first weekend in March, I was called by Judge Hidalgo probably around April to look at the county's relief and recovery from the perspective of vulnerable communities, obviously communities of color, immigrant communities, working families that would be impacted by the closure of the economy, right? And so we took several silos that we wanted to look at, and one of those, I'll talk about the other ones just briefly, just to mention them, but I want to, because we're on evictions, I think that should be something that we spend most of our time. So the county in turn was doing a big effort on food insecurity, on helping the Houston Food Bank in the distribution of food throughout the county, throughout the region, working with a lot of nonprofits. And so, the county put resources there at the Houston Food Bank. We did a lot of work on the digital divide. The county put in about $32 million in purchasing devices and also connectivity, purchasing about 100,000 hotspots for families that obviously are having a tough time getting on virtual learning as we speak, even though, several ISDs are, having different face-to-face requirements, virtual learning, hybrid learning. So we felt from the county's perspective that it was a wise investment. And so that work started in the summer, and Commissioner Garcia unanimously got a item passed through Commissioner's Court to spend $32 million in CARES Act money. So let me also back up. Each municipality, the county and the city both got roughly about $400 million in CARES Act money, and enormous amount of resources, but those resources have been committed to different projects, right? So food insecurity, digital divide, but also the public health pandemic itself, right? So standing up expanding a lot of your testing capacity, your contact tracing. And so a lot of the CARES Act money was expended for that. And finally, there's other avenues that we worked on, but finally, the stand-up of the Housing Stability Task Force, of which Judge Brown is a co-chair along with Rick Campo, and actually Zoe Middleton is a member of that about 24, 25 member task force. And it's comprised of a diverse group of people, right? People with very strong opinions about housing, public policy, advocacy, but also industry. And so one of the first things in organizing and actually we had a press conference over in Judge Brown's area in court to establish a city and county housing stability task force, because we knew evictions were a problem. Evictions were a problem prior to the pandemic, right? So we felt that there was a need to respond to that. And so both the city and the county have expended about, from $40 to $60 million combined in either rental assistance or direct assistance to combat, a lot of the housing crisis that we're in now, right? And one of the biggest recommendations, one of the most important recommendations that we were unfortunately unsuccessful, was to convince the city to pass a citywide moratorium. We weren't successful in that, but what I do want to say on the positive side of the task force was that it did bring a lot of folks together that probably weren't talking. And one of the things that we did do that I think that was an accomplishment was, and that we're still working on that, right, is the alignment of the cities and the counties, both rental assistance programs, because both of those programs are run through Baker Ripley. And Baker Ripley, if you don't know, is one of the largest nonprofits in our region, probably in the state, that probably $200-300 million budget. And so they were tasked both by the city and the county to pass rental assistance programs and to actually do the nuts and bolts of doing the intake, but also the distribution of those rental assistance monies. And look, landlords had to sign up for it. Some people were unfortunately not able to be provided assistance. But one of the things that we did was align the two programs because they were a little off in their, and that's putting it mildly. They were off in the amount of money that the city and the county were putting together. They were off in how each city and county were going to require paperwork for the landlords and the tenants. And so there was an alignment that were items passed at the county level to better align the two programs. And I think by and large, they're not completely aligned. I will, I just be frank with you about that. They're not completely aligned, but they're better situated than they were when they initially started the program. And so the Housing Stability Task Force, as we speak now, is now mostly, it's going to be a county-led effort with recently the city deciding to pull back. But the county judge has been very aggressive. And when I have my weekly calls with her, she wants to know what's going on. And so this is something that she cares about and has sent notice to the task force to, do some more data reporting on evictions, how many evictions are happening, what are the best practices, what is legal aid, how does legal aid work into that big component. And so obviously now you have the CDC requirements that are helpful. The state of Texas has provided some of their CARES Act money, $171 million of CARES Act money from the state. About $167 million are targeted to rental assistance, and about $4.2 million is targeted to the Supreme Court for the state's legal aid providers for pro bono services. And so the county is also, and the city are both aggressively trying to, obviously do better in its access to justice, in providing legal aid services. So there is an effort on that. So let me end by talking about, and I'll take any questions that anybody might have, but I will end on some legislation that my office, now learning from folks like Zoe, learning from folks like Judge Brown and others in the legal aid community is, and working with my staff, Rachel Petrosky, she's probably listening, but for those of you guys who don't know, Rachel's my kind of point person on these housing. She's my legislative director, and she's been working hard on we've been bouncing ideas on what we can do for next legislative session, because, we're less than 30 days from an election, and we'll probably we will elect a new speaker. Hopefully it will be a Democratic speaker. I do have my opinions on who that might be, but that's for another CLE. But I do want to talk about some of the things that we have been throwing around. One would be to allow eviction records to be sealed or expunged, right? So particularly when folks have win their cases. And so it shouldn't be a detriment if you win your case, if you're trying to go get another apartment, that should be a mark on your record, right? So looking at legislation through the lens of those vulnerable communities, right? Those families, particularly women of color that are disproportionately impacted by evictions. And so, and being raised by a single mom, I understand that. And so, and having that personal experience, I understand that personally. And so the other idea was right to counsel. So in probably less than 3% of eviction cases, and Judge Brown can probably correct me on that, but my understanding is probably less than 3% of folks that show up to an eviction proceeding, less than 3% of those folks actually have counsel, right? So bolstering that through the legislative process. And so we're coming up with some ideas on how to boost that portion of it. So to make it easier for re-entering tenants to find housing, right? So we have an idea to prohibit landlords from enacting blanket bans on occupancy for tenants who have a criminal record, right? Because one of the things that you want to do is to look, folks make mistakes, but you don't want to unfortunately disproportionately impact folks that might need housing, but that might have made mistakes, some time back, right? So trying to get a balance of folks that would qualify for housing in the future. Reform, one of the things we're bouncing ideas on is reforming the notice to vacate, right? So right now, because tenants often confuse a notice to vacate with an eviction, right? we're looking at ways to change the language that from that notice to vacate to conspicuously put on there that on that notice to vacate that this is not an eviction, right? So that's one of the things that we're looking at to do. And so I'm excited about the next legislative session, you know, for our prospects of obviously winning the House, but our prospects for actually working on behalf of working people, working on behalf of people that struggle. And so the last thing I will say is, you know, in protecting tenants' rights during disaster. So I had a bill last session that would have, you know, given notice to tenants when that apartment unit actually was flooded, right? And so to give warning to folks that and obviously that was brought about out of an idea in response to Hurricane Harvey and all the folks in the Greenspoint area and all throughout the region. I'm sorry, it's just everywhere, but particularly apartments in that North Houston quadrant that were impacted by some of these landlords. They're really shady, right? I mean, I was out there. I was actually in my truck, in my car, visiting apartment dwellers and tenants, and you know, hearing the horror stories from some of these landlords that you know, they're really slumlords, right? And let's just be frank about it. There's some people that do right. I'm not. Let's be honest about that too. There's some people I've met, some owners that want to do right, but you know, unfortunately, there's some bad actors out there. And so, one of the things is when there is a hurricane or there is a disaster, is to and obviously you have to submit or provide a deposit that if your apartment is flooded, that you get your deposit back, right? Because you don't have anything to go back to, right? So this little money that you would have there, you know, give that back to that person so they can move on, right? But those are the type of things that we're contemplating filing this session. I'll stop there.
That's a lot of amazing stuff you have going on there, Representative Walle. I think you could be a whole CLE for an hour or two just on that, but it sounds like you've got a really good grasp on what actually is happening out on the street. You know, the county civil courts live with Judge Williams in Court 3. Last week we went out to Aldine Library, the library out there, to try to set up Zoom room. We're going to work with the library system to set up Zoom rooms for self-represented litigants, because just like we have with the courthouse downtown, we have so many people that mobility is a challenge to get down there and pay for it, where I think this pandemic has taught us that this technology is going to be around for a while, and you allowing self-represented litigants who can't afford an attorney to appear with Zoom is a great thing. But if you don't have a Wi-Fi, and you possibly don't have a house, how do you get connected? And so we're working with the libraries for that also. So the way the program, thank you for sharing all of that. Now we're going to kind of get to what our how does an eviction work? What happens in an eviction from the beginning? And we're going to go kind of quickly through what the court proceeding is. And then we're going to talk to the tenant advocates about how does it really work and what are their concerns and what is it that people listening to this CLE can learn about if they have a friend or family member that is facing a possible eviction. Who would they contact and what can they do? And of course, as a judge, I'm going to stay real neutral on that, but I want people to understand the game rules of how it works. So with that, Judge Brown, will you please tell us how it starts in the JP court?
Thank you, Judge Kovach. And I'll preface this with this statement, my bias statement, that in the state of Texas, we treat housing as a commodity rather than a right. So because we treat it as a commodity, profit is the motivation. So most of the eviction cases that we hear are for non-payment of rent. And regardless if you have mold in your apartment, regardless if you have uninhabitable circumstances, if you don't pay the rent, that landlord by a state policy is able to move forward with a non-payment of rent, with an eviction. So if you're late on rent by the first, by the third, a landlord can send you a notice to vacate. They have to send you a notice to vacate before they actually go along with the proceeding, right? When you have a notice to vacate, if you haven't paid the back rent or if you hadn't paid the late fees, they can move forward with an eviction filing. They'll file that in one of the 16 JP courts in Harris County, 2 JPs in each precinct. it only has to, the only requirement is that the housing or whatever apartment has to be in that particular precinct, and they have the choice of choosing what JP in that specific precinct that they can go to. After it's filed, because we treat it as a commodity rather than a right, we have to, as a JP, have to put it on a docket no earlier than 10 days, no later than 21 days. So think about it. You have basically, if you're late on rent for 1 month, like that process can happen within 30 days. Once it comes to the JP court for final hearing, again, regardless of a plethora of issues that you may have with your apartment, regardless of the issues you may have with your landlord, for me, if it's for non-payment of rent, because we treat it as a commodity and because we have to move forward with the eviction in case. And I see it through my court that disproportionately affects poor Black and brown individuals. And regardless who the landlord is, because our policy tends to be racist and tends to be commodity driven, that regardless of that person's circumstance, regardless if they lost their job because of COVID or other issues, we have to move forward with the eviction. And even to appeal, you have 5 days to either appeal or move out. Even in the appeal, you still have to pay money to the registry of the court to actually do an appeal, because we don't vet. Again, it's not about housing stability, it's about profit. And because our system of housing is pushed by profit, that's why our system in the court system is very piecemeal. Is very a meal-oriented policy. So again, the process itself is the JP process. The commentary is minds and minds alone, if you will.
Thank you, Judge Brown. So as Judge Brown said, once a case goes through the Justice of the Peace Court, if the tenant, in most cases, on non-payment of rent cases, the landlord is, in a majority of cases, is going to succeed. And in those cases, then the tenant has the right to appeal to the county court at law. And when they do so, it's a de novo appeal. And they can do that, they either have to post a bond or they can use a pauper's affidavit. And I would say the vast majority are folks that are going to file a pauper's affidavit. The landlord can challenge the pauper's affidavit. And in doing so, when they do that, the tenant is the one who has to prove up that they are a pauper. So it kind of shifts the burden. And that's a little bit important because I'm going to talk about the CDC order and how we're interpreting the burden in those cases. So when a case comes up to our court, they are expedited matters also. So just like Judge Brown said, they're supposed to go first, and that's supposed to be the first cases that I move on my docket. So when they come up to the county court at law, when you look at the legislation, if you are, if everybody, unless you're representing yourself pro se, you have to have an attorney once you get to the county civil courts at law. Well, there's an exception, and that is for apartment complexes. So apartment managers are the only non-lawyers allowed to represent somebody in the county civil courts at law. So it shows you what the legislature, just what the laws, how they're written. And they have to represent a multifamily unit, which is 4 apartments or more. Then non-lawyers can come in and they don't even have to have their client, and they can proceed in our court. Because of COVID, I want to kind of move into the COVID and what's happened with COVID in the moratoriums. And we've heard different things. You know, there was the CARES Act. The CARES Act was passed, and what the CARES Act does is it requires that if an apartment landlord, if they get assistance through federal-backed mortgage, that there's a moratorium on their ability to go forward. Recently, the CDC passed the CDC halt, which is an order that if a tenant is being evicted, if they can adhere to 5 things that they can present that to the landlord, which then stops and halts the eviction. The 5 things that they have to attest to, and I'm going to share my screen here in a second. So the 5 things they have to attest to is that they've, 1, used the best efforts to obtain all available government assistance. And here I'm going to share my screen. This is our County Civil Court at Law website. And on this website, you can see from the Texas Supreme Court emergency orders. So we've listed on here the 24th order, which addresses the CARES Act and how that affects proceeding with an eviction. And then the 25th order, we've included it, which addresses how we interpret the CDC order. The CDC order, let me pull it up.
Judge, we're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Let me share the screen. There you go. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so here again, let me show you. This is our website. And on our website, we have the information about the CARES Act and the moratorium it provided. We have the Supreme Court's 24th order, which addresses it. And then what's currently the main thing that's happening right now is the CDC temporary halt. And what it's doing is if a tenant can adhere to 5 declaration items and present that to the landlord, then they cannot be evicted and the landlord cannot proceed until January 1. But the landlord is allowed to challenge it. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about the process in our court about how that works. Here is the declaration form. And as you can see, it's very simple for a tenant to fill out. It's a 2-page form that they sign, provide to the landlord. The Texas Supreme Court set the guidelines as to that the courts are to determine the procedure for challenging it. And what they also said is that tenants do have to file it with the court. So they should be filed with the court. But here's what the tenant adheres to in order to take advantage of the temporary halt: that they use their best efforts to obtain government assistance, that they earn less than $100,000, less than $99,000, that they're unable to pay their rent in full due to a substantial loss caused by the pandemic, that they're using their best efforts to make partial payment, which is critical, that they're trying to do something, and that if they're evicted, they would likely be homeless, which would create a greater illnesses from the pandemic. And that they understand that at the end in January, that their rent is not being forgiven, that they will still owe the rent come January, although they can't be forcibly evicted during that time. So what is happening is tenants are using that, and now landlords are coming in and challenging it. Our court proceedings, and this is for the 4 county civil courts at law in Harris County, is we've all agreed that once we get notice of the CDC declaration, we are going to stop, not allow the issuance of a writ of possession to actually forcibly evict someone. If a landlord wants to come in and challenge it, they have to state in writing which declarations they challenge and which ones they believe are not true. And then they have to give 10 days notice to the tenant before they can have a hearing on that matter. When I talked earlier about a pauper's affidavit, the pauper's affidavit, the tenant then has to prove they're a pauper. In the CDC declaration, we've heard arguments that the tenant should have to prove the items listed in the declaration. We disagree. We believe the standard and the burden is on the landlord to challenge and prove that the statement's not true. And with that being said, I've kind of laid the ground rule. Sorry if I stumble a little bit over my words. Judge Brown, do you want to add something in there?
I think another piece is the Texas Supreme Court has mandated the JP courts in their citation put information about the CDC affidavit in our citation. So when we send the citation, the citations to tenants about their court date, in that citation is information about the CDC affidavit. Also, we're mandated as JPs to talk to tenants about the CDC order and seeing if they qualify. So I want to put that on the front end, that The issue is if when people challenge the CDC affidavit because if they lie or if we think they're lying, it can be criminal charges, criminal penalties against them. Quite frankly, a tenant that is not represented has to balance whether they want to, their right to remain silent is questioned, because if they do remain silent, they'll be evicted. If they talk, not knowing their legal obligations, they may be subject to criminal penalty. So that's an issue that's been raised by advocates related to the challenging of the CDC affidavit, because somebody that's unrepresented may perjure themselves and not know that they perjure themselves because they don't have representation.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, the penalty for a landlord to go forward is very stiff also. It's a $100,000 fine and up to a year in prison. So it's very significant also. So it's important that people understand this CDC order and the ramifications from being untruthful on either side. It could be serious. I know a little later we're going to talk also, Judge Brown, about the eviction avoidance program, that's the pilot program, and about talking about how to minimize eviction cases up at the start of the proceedings. I'd like to hear from Mr. Kwartler, and I'd kind of like to open it up to Mr. Kwartler and Ms. Lewis and Ms. Middleton, and just kind of have a roundtable discussion. And like I said, since I'm judge, I'm gonna try to not give legal advice or go too far, but I'd like to hear y'all's take on how you see it and what your positions are, how you're intaking clients. What do you do, Mr. Kwartler? What resources do you have for tenants? I know that before the pandemic and before we went to virtual, we actually allowed you to come up on the 5th floor where the county civil courts at law are, and during our eviction dockets to talk to people. And it's not barratry, it's permitted because you're a nonprofit and you aren't soliciting clients for profit. You are providing a legal service, an educational service. So if you'll please kind of walk through, I'll start with you, Mr. Kwartler, and then if Ms. Middleton or Ms. Lewis want to chime in on their firsthand experiences with cases.
Sure. So I think that the number one thing I can say is get a lawyer, because a lot of these issues are very complicated in the way that Judge Brown laid out, that each one of those requirements or those attestations in the declaration is full of traps. So you need to understand exactly what you're signing. For some people, it may not be appropriate to sign that declaration. However, for most people, it's going to be pretty close. They're going to be able to do something minor, or they will already qualify. But the other thing that's important to remember is that it pushes the eviction. It doesn't eliminate it. The idea behind the order is that we are in a public health emergency right now, that the most important thing to us needs to be stopping this pandemic. And so we have a situation where no one is doing well, where you have landlords who aren't getting paid rent and you have tenants who are facing eviction. Neither of those things is okay. But right now, we know that eviction is a major driver of expanding the virus, both not just homelessness, but the process of eviction. There may be certain JPs who are currently running in-person eviction dockets with up to 87 cases. And that's not okay. That's an eviction mill that's also a super spreader event, and it happens every week. So it's not just homelessness. It is the actual process of eviction. A lawyer can keep you out of that courtroom. A lawyer can make sure that you are represented when you're done. Because if you hit January and you haven't paid your rent and you haven't been evicted because you filed that declaration, the bill's coming due. And you are not going to have a lawyer unless you already got one, because there's going to be such a rush that everyone who is already prepared with a lawyer is going to have an easier time finding representation. So for all those reasons and more, I have to say, get a lawyer. You can get a lawyer. Legal services providers in Houston are standing ready to help people. Lone Star Legal Aid, us, Houston Volunteer Lawyers, University of Houston Law Center, Earl Carl Institute are all taking eviction cases, are taking cases with declarations. The other thing about the declaration is, as has been mentioned, it needs to be filed with the court. Now, the tenant can do that by sending an email to the myJP, X1 or 2 email address, which is great. But the best way to make sure it gets filed and have a record is have an attorney file it through e-file. So if you can get all of that done, if you can get an attorney to help you, you are going to be in a much, much better position than you would be without one. So I really have to reiterate, and I know that you may think I'm biased because this is what I do, but getting an attorney right now, if you have had an eviction filed on you, is the best way to proceed. If you have not had an eviction filed on you, you should still fill out that CDC declaration and give it to the landlord if you believe you're at risk for eviction. Because what the order says is that the declaration should prevent any action designed to remove someone from the home. A notice to vacate is an action. A filing of an eviction is an action. Those declarations should stop that in its tracks before you even get that filing on your record. So anyone who's behind on your rent, anyone who thinks they might be behind on their rent, look at the declaration. If it applies to you, sign it, give it to the landlord. And by the way, make sure you get a record and a receipt or tape the conversation. So you make sure you know and you can prove that the landlord refused that declaration.
Mr. Kwartler, can I ask you, so, this is the Harris County Democratic Lawyers, and so there's probably lawyers out there, and I know that Houston Volunteer Lawyers used to, prior to the pandemic, they actually didn't take non-payment of rent cases because there was so little they could do as far as defenses. But now, because of the pandemic and the rights afforded to tenants under the CDC declaration, that they are now taking these cases and have a lot of lawyers actually volunteering, even from big law firms. If any lawyers are out there that want to learn so that they could actually assist a tenant, but maybe they don't, they don't usually practice in this area, who should they contact and how would they go about doing that?
So HCDLA is a great way to go. They are taking those cases now. We're all taking those cases now. HVL, Houston Volunteer Lawyers. And I forgot to give this caveat. All of these opinions are my personal opinions and not the opinions of my employer. That's a very important thing for me to say. But Houston Volunteer Lawyers is a great way to go. Also, if you have questions, you can call me personally and I'll put my office number in the chat to make sure everyone has that. If you have a referral, you can send them to our intake line. You can send them to Lone Star Legal Aid, to Houston Volunteer Lawyers, any of those organizations, and they will take the case. Right now, if we can't take those cases, we are heavily referring to each other to make sure that the individual has the best shot at getting a lawyer from someone. So, yeah.
And are you working with the other law schools as well?
Yes. So Earl Carl Institute, is taking these cases at a higher rate. University of Houston Law Center has their consumer law clinic. They're taking some of them, but they do not have the same volume as we do and as Earl Carl does. But aside from those, Houston Volunteer Lawyers and Lone Star Legal Aid are definitely the big providers.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Middleton or Ms. Lewis, do one of y'all want to tell us about what how about Ms. Middleton, you tell us about your program and how you're involved in this. And then we'll have Ms. Lewis give us kind of her experience in representing people and her experience in the courts and what really happens to folks.
Well, I'd hesitate to call it a program, but we have an approach to advocacy that is kind of following both data and people in really complex scenarios. So in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic and the eviction crisis, it's speaking to people that are moving through eviction courts, but also tracking the volume and the approach of people, of both attorneys, landlords, and JPs in eviction court. And so we've been, at every stage trying to advocate to reduce the harm, because I think there is, the harm is so obvious and so enormous that nothing short of a real moratorium, which the CDC order is not, would keep people housed, and nothing short of really deep rent assistance or rent cancellation would obviate the debt. So there's that kind of like caveat. So we've been tracking cases, and I think there are a few important notes. I think number one, like we're talking to a bunch of like legal services providers and lawyers, and I think a lot of the reflections here today are about cases that end up going through the legal system. And we know that there are just so many eviction cases or cases of self-eviction because I think it was either Judge Brown or Rep. Walle that mentioned that, the lack of clarity that you have on a notice to vacate itself. And because of intimidation and harassment by landlords, we've seen everything from, water shutoffs to illegal lockouts, car towings, that kind of thing. So it's really important that these reflections are reflections on people that are able to at least get to a legal filing and have that right to the court and due process observed. But there's, thousands of people in Houston that I'm sure are not getting that right and are losing their homes in this time. And then I think the thing that's always striking to me is that there's such a huge gulf of experience between the people that are in court facing eviction and everyone else around them that's not facing eviction, from the service providers to the JPs to the, and those are the more sympathetic actors, right? To, the people that are doing program design, and then especially to Scotex. We had this CDC order for 13 days before Scotex issued any kind of guidance. And that's unacceptable. And in between, in Harris County, I counted this last night, actually. So in between that, there were 527 cases filed in Harris County, which is just like, it's wild to me that they would not feel the need to, and that's just one county in this massive state, right? So it's wild to me that like this lack of political will from the people that have, such an enormous amount of power in this crisis is really, really striking. And so I think that gulf of experience needs to be narrated, and that we shouldn't be afraid to talk about people who are not using their power fully or correctly or compassionately in this time. And so that's why I felt like it was very important in the chat to name the JPs that are having really high volume courts, that are not observing distancing, the JPs that are, not necessarily streaming their courts faithfully, because access to the court is important for advocacy in this time. I think it's really important that if we're going to, because we exist in a system where housing is a commodity and not a human right, like, then we ought to be very clear about the harm that people do when they uphold that worldview and that commodity, and don't use their full power to push back against that and preserve human life. So I would encourage you to go through those lists of JPs and really know, and Scotex and everyone else, and really know and understand the decisions that people are making and what those real life ramifications are for Houstonians.
Well, and that's a good point, that, judges, not just the Supreme Court, who under the emergency order, set forth some guidelines, and they kind of did leave it open for the judges to set their own procedures on how we handle the evictions. And one of the other things that is in the emergency orders that I think is important for attorneys to remember, and it's going to depend, on who your particular judge is, but it gives the judges right now, we have this unique opportunity that we're allowed to extend deadlines. We're allowed, normally we are set in, of course, any good judge is going to follow the law, apply the facts to the law. And if that's what the law says, those are the deadlines. But right now we're allowed to actually extend deadlines because of the pandemic and the emergency order. And I don't get asked very often by attorneys to extend deadlines on items, but that's something that I certainly would consider in any case, if appropriate. And I have a unique opportunity right now that I actually can use my discretion on that. So anyway, something for litigants to remember, and attorney advocates. So Ms. Lewis, why don't you tell us about, I know you've had some experiences, in fact, sometimes in the court where I actually am the presiding judge. I know you've had experiences in the past, and just what does this do? What happens to the tenants who are overwhelmingly people of color, and especially women, who find themselves faced with an eviction?
Well, yeah, hi. Again, I am UA Lewis, and I am the current chair of the Houston Lawyers Association's Judicial Oversight and Selection Committee. But prior to that, I did a lot of eviction defense. I was committed to only doing eviction defense because the court was stacked against individuals like single mothers and individuals uh, of all races and colors, but particularly of color, were faced on the court in bulk. And I had experiences that landlords were so confident that they'd be successful, they wouldn't even show up with files to prove that they were even in a contractual relationship with the tenants. And so because of that, I just really wanted to focus on the underrepresented class of individuals on the eviction side. And so what I want to say is that I think that based on the current moment, but despite the past, that we have to make sure that we don't despair with some of the changes, because creativity is going to rule the day. The defendants need to be creative, just like the landlords are trying to be creative to circumvent this order that's currently in place by trying to still seek evictions for other reasons like conduct. We're going to see a rash of conduct-based evictions since they can no longer do the non-payment of rent. We're going to see that the evictions for, they will let the lease period expire and then use that for a basis of eviction. But I think that the spirit of this order should not allow that, because the spirit of the order is to allow people to stay in place for their health and safety's sake. And I think it should be challenged if a landlord is to come forward and say that that their eviction should go forward for an expiration of a lease during this period. I think that's important to challenge that if that is going forward in federal court if need be. Further, I think that the tenants need to be creative in defending that. You have to make sure that they cross all their I's and dot all their T's in these evictions. I have found in my experience that you will find landlords, again, with such confidence that they've changed names of the apartment complex 50 different times leading up to, and they will file it on a new name when the lease is in an old name. And that doesn't work. You will find that the notice to vacate has not been properly delivered. And that's an element. They have to do that. The law put that in place for a reason. So I would say just, we build on the creativity. And further, one last thing I want to add is that, we have all these ideas on how we can help women of color or anybody, I would say, that's faced with living paycheck to paycheck and being afraid that they would not be able to continue to stay where they are. This money would be equally and better served if some of that money is used for home ownership. Home ownership is the path to wealth and out of the position that they are. And I don't see that being a part of the conversation, and it needs to be a part of the conversation, that this money that they're setting aside for these landlords to be reimbursed could actually be put towards home ownership efforts for these individuals, so they don't have to have the stress of living paycheck to paycheck and wondering if a landlord will eventually evict them one day. So that's what I would say. We need to be more creative in this at this point.
Judge, can I build on something that UA said?
Absolutely, please go ahead and join in. We're coming up. It's looks like we've got a few minutes before 1 o'clock, but yeah, go ahead. And then I'd like, I don't know if Judge Brown is the person to speak a little bit about the early deferral program, but just like Ms. Lewis was saying, some of these resources, I know Judge Brown is big on this, about using the resources up front. When you've got somebody that's $200 short on their rent, if we have resources for somebody to get the $200, the landlord's been paid, and it saves off the eviction, which is going to end up costing thousands of dollars down the road. And so it's a matter of priority in our communities. But go ahead, Mr. Kwartler.
So one thing that I like to tell people is that locks are meant to keep honest people out. That laws are not force fields. Laws just say what you're supposed to do, and in some cases provide a consequence for doing that, for not doing that. When we saw with the CARES Act, there was no consequence for not doing that. And what we saw was that in Harris County, about 1/4 of the evictions filed during the moratorium were filed in violation of the CARES Act. So I don't want people to think that we are protected now. I don't want people to think that they are safe, because they're only safe if everyone cooperates. They're only safe if the law works for them. And for a lot of people, it's never going to work for them. And so obviously that's, ties back into my point of getting a lawyer. But every protection we have, everything that is in place for tenant protection right now is nothing more than an illusion for a lot of people. Do not trust all landlords to follow those laws, or assume that those laws will result in all landlords following them. You need to get a lawyer, or at least make sure that nothing is going wrong with your case to the best of your ability.
Thank you, Mr. Kwartler. Judge Brown, just 1 minute, because we're coming right up on time. I see Mr. Dubel's joined us back before he cuts us off.
Judge, we can go for another 5 or 10 minutes. We got a lot of people interested and a lot of questions out there, so go ahead.
Okay, we're okay. Okay. So Judge Brown, I know that you've done a lot of work on this, and you and I have talked even about your experiences when I think you came from Michigan. You said they had different programs, and with Representative Walle and some of the things that he is now putting forward. What do you think? We've got a pandemic, and we've got the issue right now. And on one thing, it's really brought the light onto this situation, which it's terrible, the situation, but at least the light is on it. And maybe it's a time where we can make some of these changes and make our communities safer and healthier, having less people homeless and people in a safe environment to live. What do you think is needed, and where do you think the resources need to go?
One, we have a lack of affordable housing in Houston. Houston has some of the worst affordable housing for particularly low-income folks in the country. Two, it's no secret that we didn't have an uptick in evictions when the CARES Act and the unemployment insurance money was given out, because it was tied to $15 an hour, right? When people have an affordable wage, they're able to live in their community. Three, we have racist policies in the city of Houston. In the state of Texas, particularly source of income discrimination, that an apartment complex can not rent to you because you're paying with a housing voucher. 95% of the folks that pay with a housing voucher are African-American. We have racist policies, plus being a commodity-driven housing stock is why we are in this position right now. This eviction crisis that we are looking at, COVID, highlights a broader problem, right? It's not causing, COVID didn't cause it, it's just highlighting the problem. A problem, quite frankly, that certain members of our community have been facing for a long time, particularly on the east side of Houston.
Judge Kovach, can I jump in and
Sure.
I pulled a question out of the chat that was asked a couple of times. Apparently there's some litigation involving that order in HHS in Atlanta. Are y'all familiar with that? Yeah. Somebody posted in the chat, if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so I know that there were some landlord groups that have challenged the constitutionality of the CDC order. And, but as far as I know, and I do talk with the Texas Apartment Association and their general counsel, and I've asked them that if there's anything that ever becomes an order to let me know, and I've not gotten anything. But as far as I know, there's not been a court that's held it to be unconstitutional, that we're giving it full force and effect. I'm not sure if anybody else on the panel has heard anything more, but I've checked.
Later, somebody posted in the chat a link to an order that indicates it might not be as broad as what some advocates have been, but I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, well, there's two sides to everything. And so, just like I said, as far as implementing and how the four of us, the four Harris County courts at law, we take the position that the declaration is taken valid on its face, and the burden is on the landlord to overcome it. But I can't speak for other courts. In other counties, I suspect they're doing it the opposite way.
The Texas Supreme Court has given us guidance with its latest order on how to do the affidavit. And regardless of what unless the Texas Supreme Court says otherwise, the JPs are handling it in a way where it's still consistent with what Judge Kovach is saying. Because we're not a court, we can't talk about the constitutionality. We're not a jurisdiction that ponders constitutionality.
If UA is still with us, there's a point I'd like to follow up with her on that she made in our prep session yesterday. UA, are you there still? We may have lost her. Let's turn to Representative Walle, and let's sort of think outside the box. What's a better system? What can we do with the legislature? What's your dream system?
Well, the dream system would be, kind of jumping off what Judge Brown mentioned about affordable housing. I mean, these are all systemic problems, right? Systemic issues that we need to tackle, obviously at the national level, but from my perspective, I'm going to be pushing the envelope, in the legislature to talk about housing, talk about, wage parity, the income distribution or distribution that we don't have among just the average person to earn a living wage is just not there. And so, but to stay on point, I mean, because I'm talking about global things, but to stay on point as it relates to housing and evictions, I'm a file a slew of bills, and these agencies. Look, sometimes there are bills that you file to make a point, and others that you really do want to pass, right? And these are bills that I do want to pass. So these and it puts the industry on notice that, and I think we could get some help from folks, but I think we have good momentum to try to change some things for the better. Look, we have another chamber, right? we don't control the Senate. We don't control any branch of government, top to bottom. So even if we do, take control of the House and maybe we win some of these Supreme Court positions, it's a step in the right direction, but we still have to deal with the governor's office and the Senate that may or may not take this on. But
Representative Walle, sorry, one of the things that Ms. Lewis brought up when we were talking in planning for this CLE and presentation was she was talking about the fact that on so many cases that some tenant is being evicted for non-payment of rent. Oh, I'm glad Ms. Lewis is back there. They're being evicted for non-payment of rent, and by the time the case actually reaches the court, the tenant is actually vacated already. And then the proceeding goes for the non-payment of rent, which is really just a money judgment, but it's showing up as an eviction when in fact the person voluntarily vacated prior to any actual eviction being signed or a writ of possession. And and I was talking with her about how we classify that in the court system. Because when a case comes up to us, it's classified as an eviction. And if they vacated and it's just the money judgment part, why is that not just a money judgment like any other debt, a contract dispute, so that it doesn't create such the negative on the credit report?
Yeah, absolutely, Judge. I'm in UA, and whoever has any bill ideas, I think I've put it on the chat to give my contact information. Look, I'm not gonna sit here and say I'm all knowing on all this. I've learned a lot, and in this last 6 months working with the task force and Judge Brown and Zoe and a couple others. So I certainly don't have I don't have a monopoly on the ideas, and so I'm open to any suggestions that would make it better for working people. And this eviction issue is something that it's evolved over time in my office as a priority. It just has elevated itself into something we really want to tackle.
Yeah.
Just go back to your point, regardless of once it's filed, those credit, because those are public records, once it's filed, it's as bad as a judgment. Because they only see eviction and filing, and as those credit agencies scrub our dockets, they look at the filing as they look at as the actual judgment. So regardless if the person is moved out, that filing is as bad as a judgment.
Well, and that brings up a good point, Judge Brown, and that's the eviction, the early deferral program that is starting on Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to give a few words about that? Because part of what that will do is actually electronically erase the eviction.
And that's a program by the Texas Supreme Court Governor's Office and the Texas Housing and Community Development Department have put money into a court-based program. But at the end of the day, a landlord and tenant have to agree to participate in the program. If they participate in the program, the case gets stayed for 60 days to allow for that payment of rent, and also allows for the JP to seal that filing from a person's record. Seal that filing from the court proceeding. But that's a small pilot. Now it's going to be up to $171 million. That's going to be statewide. But once the money runs out, the money runs out.
UA, I know you got to go in a second. Can I ask you a quick follow-up? Can you turn your microphone on?
Sure.
Yesterday, you mentioned something that caught my attention, and that is that a lot of these big landlords are down there using our court system, and they hadn't even paid their franchise tax. And I'd like to hear your comment on that.
Yeah, so, and I hesitate to do this because I hate to give them a roadmap to fix things in advance. But anyhow, I have found that that many times some of those creative defenses come from just checking out who is actually dragging you into court. And sometimes that person has no right to be in court, because as a business in Texas, Houston, Texas does not care that you operate a business, but they do care that you are paying your taxes. And so if you're going to use our courts, you should have enough respect to pay the taxes. And that's been my argument. Some of the judges that may be on here have heard that from me before, but that's my argument, and it's true, and it's respected by the court. So make sure you go and look at the county court's website. It will give you DBA information. You can look up the DBAs that way, and then you go to the Secretary of State and you see if they have a good franchise tax. And like I said, they change their names so often and they switch entities so often. You will be shocked at how often these entities do not pay their taxes.
I think it's a very good point and a good argument. Before we wrap it up, I just want to remind everybody that this video and all of our videos of our CLEs we've been doing since the COVID lockdown are posted on our Facebook page within a week. They're free to go back and view. There's an important one I want to give a shout out to, and that's the voter protection election law 2-hour one we did last week for election judges and people working as election workers. That's up, and if you haven't volunteered to do that, I urge you to volunteer through the Harris County Democratic Party at their website, because they can actually place you at a polling place, whereas if you go through the county clerk, you may or may not get placed. And we're trying to place as many law students, lawyers, and problem solvers as election workers. And also the Texas Democratic Party is putting together a huge effort to get poll watchers across the state. And you can find the forms at the Texas Democratic Party website to volunteer for that. Jim or Judge Kovach, you have anything you want to wrap up, or anybody want to make any final comments on the eviction issues?
I'd just like to thank everybody for participating, on the panel, and I appreciate you inviting us, Mr. Dubel. I do think that we currently, I never thought I was going to run for judge. And the reason I ran for judge is kind of what I hear Mr. Biden saying, the Democratic candidate for president, that it was just like a aha epiphany moment when he says that he saw the Charlottesville, what happened there. My moment came in court when I saw judges on eviction cases, and when a tenant would come up, and before the tenant could even explain their position, a judge would look over to the bailiff and have the bailiff come and stand behind the tenant and intimidate them so that they didn't speak. And then every other tenant after that never said a thing. And that's where I just decided I didn't want to practice law in a court like that. And I find that on most of the cases, the tenants that have not been able to pay are very apologetic. I mean, these are good people that are in a bad situation. And I hear them often, thank the landlord for having been a good landlord, and they're apologetic that they're in a situation where the money is the issue, and they're trying to do their best. And so I think if we can look at it where the court system works with the community and have the resources available, it can help everybody. I mean, that's what makes a place a good community to live in. And so I'm glad to have this conversation and to have Representative Walle here, and to look at the broader picture of, when it gets to me, it's in a critical situation, but how do we help it up front? How do we slow down the amount of evictions that are filed? How do we help people get into homes? I think it's really important that we keep the focus on that front side, and how to keep the evictions down,
And
So
I appreciate all that y'all are doing. I want to close out with a quote Eric had, if you don't mind me putting on your spot, Eric, but you quoted from a book yesterday when we were doing the prep, and I thought it was a very striking quote about, I can't remember the name of the book. Was it Evictions or Houses? Go ahead.
Evicted.
Evicted, that's it. Do you remember the quote I'm talking about?
I do. Yeah.
I'd like to close out with that. I thought it was a really nice quote.
They were talking about eviction court and how it's full of women of color. And what he said was, Black men get locked up, Black women get locked out. And it's really important to understand that this is a plague that disproportionately is an understatement, affects people of color and women of color. And we have a duty as a society to fix this problem.
And the book's called Evicted. Do you recall the author's name?
Yeah, it's Matthew Desmond. I recommend it unequivocally. It is the best book ever written for the public on eviction. It is a very striking and readable volume, and everyone should try and take a look at it.
All right. Well, thank you all for everything you're doing. Let's go out in a couple weeks or less and start voting and getting some more elected officials that can work with Representative Walle and pass some reforms to make the system better. And let's elect some more good judges like Judge Kovach and Judge Brown. I'm sure I hope to see you running for something again someday, Judge Brown. Thank each of you for participating. Any closing remarks, Judge Kovach?
stay safe out there.
All right, great program. Thank you all.